Hey, this is Derek Whatley. In this video, I'm going to go over some performance enhancements we've made to the Migration Toolkit for Containers version 1.4. To begin, let's look at this metric screen where we can see a migration on the new version of MTC compared with a migration on the old version of MTC of the exact same app. You can see that it took 10 times longer to migrate the app with the previous version in a stress test cluster environment. To set up the stress test for this video, I created 60 migration plans. These migration plans all take a little bit of time to get ready, but once they are ready, we shouldn't need to do further validation on them until it's time to run the migration. This is one of the changes we've made in Migration Toolkit to Containers 1.4. Now that all of these plans are ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and run the first stress test. And first we're going to look at the post-performance enhancement version. So if we find our first plan here and we hit the migrate button on it, we're going to see that a full migration of this app that contains Nginx and a single persistent volume claim will take around 4 minutes to complete. I've sped the video up here to show this. One of the performance enhancements with MTC 1.4 is that we no longer create migration registries as soon as the plan is created. Instead, we wait for the migration to start to create these registries. And this means that if you need to plan out an entire cluster worth of migrations, you can set up all the plans ahead of time and let them idle without any consequence. I've sped the video up here once again just to show the whole process running. This took around 4 minutes total. 4 minutes and 18 seconds to be exact after performance enhancements with 60 migration plans. Now when we jump over to some metrics and we look at the amount of memory consumed by the migration controller, we can see that we're using around 67 megabytes of memory for the CAM container, which contains the migration controller. And this hovers around that region for the entirety of the migration. So it's very stable in that sense within this test. When we look at the Prometheus metrics that we have coming out of the controller, we can see that there was an initial spike of requests sent off while reconciling all of the plans and getting them ready, but the actual migration took around 2,000 requests to complete in total. Now, if we look at MTC 1.3 before these performance enhancements were applied, the first thing we'll notice is that as soon as the controller started up, we're going to end up with 60 registry pods on each of our clusters, just because we have 60 migration plans that are sitting there idling. And these registry pods aren't really going to be used before the migration, so it's a little wasteful. I've skipped ahead here to where the registries are all started, and we're running our second migration plan. And because of a lot of factors, one of those big factors being the remote watch system, even though this was massively sped up, you can see that this migration actually took 38 minutes to complete compared to 4 minutes for MTC 1.4, which is about 9.5 times slower. And we can see that again here looking at the metrics. So you can see that's the first migration runtime, and then the second line here represents the runtime of the second migration. When we look at some other metrics that we have for this second migration on the older version of MTC, we notice that it uses 3 times the memory consumption compared to the new optimized version. And we can also see a pretty big difference if we look in the region where the migration was actually running. There were about 2,000 requests in the optimized version versus around 20,000 for the unoptimized MTC 1.3 release. And we also notice that there's an ability in the new version of MTC for the controller to go almost completely idle when it's not doing work. You can see how it flatlines in the middle, but between startup after it's completed the initial reconcile and then before the first migration happens. And then once the migration is complete, you can see it flatlines once again, meaning that it's sort of truly idling, which is a good thing in terms of making sure that your cluster doesn't get overloaded. One of the biggest focuses with MTC 1.4 was to make sure that this tool will work even on the largest clusters with the most activity. So hopefully these changes will help you do migrations on that type of cluster.